Welcome to Talk Time with Tracy. Today I am here and with me is Derek Kilmer. And as you all know, I'm Tracy Flood, president of the NAACP, Unit 1134. And Congressman Kilmer is our congressman in the 6th Congressional District. So welcome, Congressman Kilmer.
It's good to see you, Tracy.
Thank you.
I wish we could do this in person. I'm tired of. I feel like every meeting I have is like the beginning of the Brady Bunch with a bunch of boxes on my screen.
Well, today we're going to make this as personable as possible. I was hoping that we would be able to be in person too, and especially today because the sun's out.
No kidding.
So, with just a little bit of your background, growing up in Port Angeles, being here in the Great Northwest, attending college. Tell us, what drove you into being a congressman?
Yeah, I grew up in Port Angeles, as you mentioned. I was in high school right around the time the timber industry took it on the chin. And I saw a bunch of my friends' parents lose their jobs, a bunch of my neighbors lose their jobs. And it had a big impact on me. It kind of altered the trajectory of my adult life. I went off to college. Literally, my senior thesis in college was how do you help timber towns in Washington State? And then did the same thing in graduate school. I looked at mining towns in the UK and timber towns in Washington, basically trying to get my head around how do you help communities be sustainable economically and make sure that no matter what zip code you live in, you have economic opportunity. And I didn't think I'd run for office. I went and worked for a few years in business, trying to get out of student debt, unsuccessfully, by the way, Tracy. And then went to work for a nonprofit focused on economic development and focused on trying to bring more jobs to our region and trying to keep the jobs we have. And I got grumpy. I kept finding myself saying, gosh, what government does and doesn't do, for good and for bad, sure impacts our ability to grow jobs.
That is so true.
And finally, some of my friends said, you seem to have a lot of good ideas and you sure complain a lot. Why don't you go do something about it, pal? And the next thing I knew, I was serving in the state legislature.
And here you are. And we just are wanting to check in right now. Just do kind of a check-in because so much has happened over the last year. And, in 2019, we'd have never thought in 2020 we would spend 8 months pretty much in quarantine and facing that pandemic, looking at what happened with George Floyd, the elections, just so much has happened. So let's kind of start with COVID and the pandemic and where we are with the CARES Act and legislation.
Yeah. Well, let me just say a few things. One, this year's been the pits, undeniably. And I made a decision, gosh, about a year ago that if someone lost their job or lost their business or lost a loved one and reached out to my office, that I wasn't going to send them a form letter in response, that I'd call them. And so, as you can imagine, I'm talking to folks every day almost that really have had the rugs pulled out from under them. And the statistics are really jaw-dropping around the number of folks who were employed a year ago and now are not, the number of folks who are hungry or can't afford to pay their rent, the number of people who've had to leave the workforce entirely. And to me, having those conversations has really created a sense of urgency to have the federal government step up and provide help to people. So you mentioned, the sort of there have been several waves of response by Congress. I've kind of likened it to the scene in Jaws where Brody says, we're going to need a bigger boat. Every time Congress has responded, there's a quick recognition, holy cow, we're going to need a bigger boat. The most recent response bill is something called the American Rescue Plan, which I actually think is a really big deal and really important. Importantly, it provides funding to beat back this virus, to get more vaccines out the door and into arms, and to address some of the underrepresentation we've seen among communities of color and some communities that have had a harder time accessing the vaccine. So there's funding for that. There's
Yes.
also, importantly, a lot of resources for people who are just struggling. What's gotten the attention is the additional round of the kind of pandemic rebate checks,
Mhm.
but also, extend unemployment benefits for folks, providing rental assistance and utility assistance, nutrition assistance, and help for small businesses. Including our local restaurants. There's a new grant program to help our small restaurants that have really gotten hammered through this. So that I feel like, I'm grateful that the Biden administration has really focused its attention on this, and on trying to help folks weather both the significant public health crisis and the economic challenges. And I was pleased to support that American Rescue Plan because I think it helps get folks the assistance that they need.
Well, that is a great update, and it pushes us into um, understanding that there's been different batches of funding and
Yeah.
what current batch of funding we're currently in. And that included extending the personal protection laws for small businesses and actually opening up a period for there to be applicants for those small businesses with less than 20 employees to be able to have a period in time. And the most vulnerable businesses, the mom and pop shops, um, those that basically had struggles during the first wave and couldn't get in. So I think that was definitely one of the pluses that we saw here locally, as well as the increase in access to the vaccines. So
Yeah.
accessibility.
I do feel like the federal government's, it's this whole thing has sort of been building the plane mid-flight. And, we're, as lessons get learned, you're seeing changes. So for example, you mentioned the Paycheck Protection Program. The first round, there were problems, undeniably. I mean, as a resident of the state of Washington, Tracy, I have always hated the Los Angeles Lakers, but I particularly hated them when I found out that they tried to get a Paycheck Protection Program loan, because that's not what that's for, right? It's not to pay NBA players. It's to help Main Street employers in Port Orchard and Bremerton and Paulsbo and Bainbridge, and too many folks who actually needed the help weren't able to access that help. And so there were changes made to make it easier to get that loan forgiveness. As you mentioned, a sort of a carve out period for those mom and pop shops, and female and minority owned businesses that too often kind of got left out of that first round. So I think there's been some thoughtful changes, and it's, because folks are kind of learning as we go.
Yes. So let's move full speed ahead into our next topic, George Floyd and the police reform, um, the issues around Black Lives Matters, and now we're seeing our Asian and Pacific Islanders hate crimes. And I know that last year, the NAACP put on a panel discussion with our police chiefs and our sheriff, and also our former Bremerton Police Chief Steve Strand, who is the executive director of in Olympia for our chiefs and sheriffs. And you attended and was in conversation there, and you gave us a little bit of an update on some legislation that was pending. Can you give us a little update on where we are now?
Yeah. Well, let me say up front, in May of last year, I think the American people watched in horror the killing of George Floyd, and it's why people took to the streets to demand change. And I think it is important to acknowledge, sadly, that the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and other Black Americans are unfortunately not isolated incidents, but they suggest the need for real reform in this country. These deaths shouldn't happen anywhere in America. And, I have tremendous respect for the folks who work in law enforcement, who work day and night to keep us safe. And I've been clear in acknowledging that there are legitimate and serious public safety threats that reinforce the need for responsible and effective law enforcement. Um, and on top of that, to their credit, you've seen some law enforcement leaders throughout our region speak out about the need to address systemic injustice and to pursue some reforms. And I respect that. And it's that view that we need to address systemic injustice and that we need reform that has led me to support a bill in Congress called the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. That is a comprehensive bill. It did pass the House in March. And there are some key components of it. One, the bill seeks to end racial profiling and to enhance training, both with regard to profiling and with regard to the use of force. Second, it tries to raise policing standards to enhance accreditation, to strengthen federal oversight. Third, there's provisions in the bill that are focused on changes regarding misconduct. So, for example, requiring independent investigation when there is officer involved fatality or use of force. That's something that in our state we've already done through the citizen initiative process. The bill also proposes creating a misconduct registry. So if someone is found to have committed misconduct in one jurisdiction, they can't just hop to another jurisdiction. I think these are common sense steps. And then there are also provisions that were part of the conversation that you and I had, when the NAACP hosted our law enforcement leaders around specific law enforcement practices, things like the use of chokeholds and carotid holds. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act addresses that, and also, at least in federal drug cases, the use of no-knock warrants. Requires body cameras and the use of dashboard cameras for federal officers, and then providing funding so state and local departments can do that as well. And listen, you asked kind of what the status of this was. It's passed the House.
Okay.
I've spoken with some folks who feel like the reforms don't go far enough, and others who think that they go too far. But I think it strikes a reasonable balance for strengthening accountability and for addressing a bias. I also think it's important to recognize that more needs to be done as well. Too often folks in law enforcement have been tasked with responding to societal problems they were never meant or equipped to handle. It is a problem that in the district I represent, in nearly every county I represent, the largest provider of mental health services is the county jail. And I haven't talked to anybody who thinks that's the best way of dealing with mental health challenges. So we've got a lot of work to do on this front. Appropriately, you mentioned some of the issues regarding hate crimes as well. The House actually, over this next work period in the month of April, will be taking on 2 bills addressing hate crimes, and a specific bill addressing hate crimes oriented towards the Asian American community as well.
Well, thank you for that update. It's one in which, as a former public defender, when you talk about the revolving doors at the jail and the treatment for mental health taking place at the jail because of a lack of resources and lack of access, it all exists. And it is one in which I believe that the county, looking at the mental health tax, the 1% there, is going to be able to do some things in that area to make it better, but there's still underlying issues. And we know that there isn't a one size fits all. We know that there's certain federal legislation that you're working on, and then certain state legislation that's happening down in Olympia. And every jurisdiction has some unique qualities, but overall, everyone wants to be able to go home and leave home, go home safe and leave home safe, and make sure their kids and their family members do that. And finding a common ground of respect for all life, but also acknowledging that there's issues that exist and not sweeping them under the rug. So
I agree. And I also think it's important that when we say Black Lives Matter, that we back it up with actions to demonstrate that Black Lives Matter. And
Yes.
that is really part of the impetus for this George Floyd Justice and Policing bill, is a recognition that these are not kind of one-off unique incidences, but they suggest the need for systemic change in this country. And I'm really hopeful that we'll see reform happen. I mentioned I supported that bill. I'm a co-sponsor of that bill, and um, uh, uh, to me, it is heartbreaking that you know I've 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 talked to parents who said, uh, I shouldn't have to teach my child that a broken taillight could mean the loss of their life, or um, the circumstances that face communities of color and their interactions with law enforcement too often are dissimilar to those of white Americans. And that is something that is not a condemnation of everyone who works in law enforcement. We are lucky to have some terrific law enforcement professionals, but we have a big country, and we have a lot of areas of our country that have some very significant problems that need to be addressed.
And I definitely know that we have the NAACP has a long working history with conversations with our local law enforcement, having a seat at the table uh, every December for the last 4 years in a community law enforcement dinner, um, and making sure that they understand that we are the oldest civil rights organization around. We're part of a national organization, and that we are here to hold them accountable, but also to help educate the public as well as our officers about the issues that exist in different cultures across the, the spectrum, uh, but starting with the acknowledgement of the importance of Black lives. So, that being said, now an issue that is another issue close to home here is student loan forgiveness. Now, having started my education at Olympic College, gone on to the University of Washington, then Seattle U, which at the time was University of Puget Sound, for law school. That's a lot of education in there, Congressman, and I know you understand that. So for
Yeah.
many of us, student loans and student loans forgiveness has been a major issue. And there's different categories that if you're not in it, you don't understand it. You're looking at it from the outside in. But even from a standpoint of saying you direct loans by the government or private loans, and wanting to have loan forgiveness through the working in nonprofits and working for the government, all of those things. But where are we now on student loan forgiveness?
A great question, and a personal one for me. It's funny, when you may remember this, when I chaired the higher education committee in the state senate. I think I was the first higher ed chair in Olympia history that was still paying off his student loans. Um, you know, I got all of it. My folks were school teachers, and I got grants and I got loans, and
Mhm.
occasionally washed dishes in the college dining room, which my wife believes is the best skill that I learned in college. But unfortunately, we've seen a massive increase in student debt in this country. Student debt has now surpassed credit card debt in America. And let's talk about what that means. It means that a lot of I met with a group of Kitsap realtors recently.
Mhm.
You've seen young people delay home ownership because of student debt. We've seen graduates who have to change their career goals because of debt. We know that student debt impedes the ability of people to start a business. So if we can agree that rising loan debt is a problem, the question is, as you said, so what do we do about it, right?
Yes,
And
yes.
so you've heard President Biden already say that he believes the law allows him to forgive as much as $10,000 in federal student loans for eligible borrowers. And he's directed the Department of Education to basically look at what levers he has
Mhm.
at his disposal on that front. You've also seen, as part of some of these COVID relief packages, at least enabling students and those with debt to press pause on their loan payments and not rack up more and more interest while we're in the midst of the pandemic with regard to their federal loans. There are some other things, though, I think that Congress can and should do. So we may very likely take up the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act later this year. And there's discussion of making things like income-based repayment plans the default option for current students and for borrowers who have graduated. That would really benefit middle class and poorer borrowers. The other reality is we have to dramatically increase financial aid to people. I mean, I look at education as the door to economic opportunity. And for a lot of families, including mine, financial aid is the key to that door. And it just has not kept pace. The Pell Grant, the purchasing power of the Pell Grant is not what it once was. We even have seen proposals to eliminate some of the federally subsidized loan programs out of the last administration. So my hope is that we can make good progress on this so that we're providing help both to current students and to folks who borrowed money and really feel impeded by the amount of debt that they have.
Well, I hope so too. I hope we're going to be able to really address it and look at it in a way that there's clearly some relief. Best way to put it is there's relief. Okay, we're going to be down to our kind of final subject here, and that's the renaming of the post office downtown Bremerton, and that wonderful honor, and hopefully looking at a dedication in person in around Veterans Day. So want to give us just kind of a quick update on that?
Yeah. Well, and I feel like I need to start by saying thank you to you and to some of the other leaders in Kitsap County, Karen Vargas and our mayor and others who supported this effort. So John Henry Turpin is someone who served our country in the military with great distinction and in an era of prejudice and discrimination. And he persistently answered the call of duty to his country. He rose in rank throughout his Navy career and was really selfless and heroic. I mean, literally saving lives when there was a boiler explosion. And so one of the ways in which Congress can honor people is through naming post offices. And the downtown Bremerton post office is not dedicated to anybody or was not until now. We actually passed a bill that got support of Democrats and Republicans and was signed into law. And as you said, we'll go through the formal dedication process of being sure to honor John Henry Turpin and his extraordinary legacy of service to our country.
Yes. So we are definitely excited about the opportunity to honor Mr. Turpin through this dedication and to be able to see the diversity in Bremerton's rich history. And a part of that will be not a new name on the outside of the post office because it is a federal building, but having a plaque and dedication in the main area of the post office. And we're hoping to have a little bit of the history there as well. Yeah. And looking to see that you're telling the story. And that will then complement what's going to be happening on 4th Street, which you're aware of the Quincy Jones Square. So there's a lot that'll be happening in downtown Bremerton.
Tracy, I should say, because the folks watching may not know the story, but just very, very briefly, John Henry Turpin is believed to be the first Black American to qualify as a master diver. He was one of the first Black Americans to achieve the rank of Chief Petty Officer in the Navy. He served 30 years and is from Bremerton. He calls Bremerton his home.
Bremerton's rich history. And this honor is just one in which We're happy to be able to do um, just understanding the richness of, again, the timing of his service during when things were still segregated. So a lot of that history was lost, and this is a way for us to recapture that. So thank you for spearheading that, and just the honor, and we look forward to being able to see that downtown. Yes.
Thank you.
So
Thanks for your partnership on
happy to partner. And so now that we've come to the end of our time, I want to thank you for being here with me today in conversation. Congressman Kilmer, it's much appreciated taking the time out of your day to check back in and to be engaged in the 6th District. Much appreciated. And thank you again for spending time with us today with Talk Time with Tracy.